Hello, my lovely friends. Welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. I have entitled today's little talk, How Bad Can Things Really Get? The passage we're going to look at is Numbers 25, the whole chapter, verses 1 to 18. Now, it's often said that when you think things can't get any worse, they often do. This can happen in our personal life, where we can see one thing break down after another, but I also believe it can occur in society as a whole. Morally, we may feel today like we're reaching new lows, wondering just how bad things truly can get. Even if we look back over just the last 20 years or so, we can see how rapidly things have degenerated from a societal point of view. Now, it's confusing and it's upsetting. But just how much worse can things get? Well, today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, whenever you're listening to this, the plan is we're going to explore together this theme as we continue our examination in the closing out of the story of Balaam. This was the guy who was asked to curse Israel, but never did. At least not as far as the passages we've explored thus far. But in Numbers chapter 25, we witness a troubling turn of events. The Moabites, terrified of the Israelites, you'll remember, they'd attempted to, first of all, to use Balaam to curse them, but now we see them take a different strategy. They attempt to seduce Israel into idolatry and adultery. Now, although Balaam isn't mentioned in this chapter, later in the book it's confirmed that he plays a role in initiating these events. He's there behind the scenes. So the story of Balaam isn't quite over yet, or certainly the consequences of his actions aren't, and what we're about to see transpires out of that, we'll discover today. So welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, friends, you're very welcome. Now, it's not such a long chapter today that we're going to have to break it down. What I plan to do is read for you the whole chapter so that you sort of get a sense of the narrative sweep, and then we'll go back and look at it in a couple of bite-sized chunks. In my Bible, this passage is given the title, Moab Seduces Israel, which is quite fitting, actually. So let me read the whole chapter for you. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to Israel's judges, "Each of you must put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor." Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord said to Moses, "Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites, since he was zealous for my honor among them as I am. I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore, Tell him I am making a covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites. The name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a Simeonite family. And the name of the Midianite woman who was put to death was Cosbi, daughter of Zur, a tribal chief of a Midianite family. The Lord then said to Moses, "Treat the Midianites as enemies and kill them. For they treated you as enemies when they deceived you in the Peor incident involving their sister Cosbi, the daughter of a Midianite leader, the woman who was killed when the plague came as a result of that incident." Now, you should immediately note, I'm sure you noticed as I read through that Balaam's name isn't mentioned in this chapter. But we learn in Numbers 31 verse 6 later on that he is in fact responsible for the corruption described here. Let me read that verse for you. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incidents, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. So we know now that Balaam is here. He's behind the scenes. Despite all of Balak's efforts initially to induce Balaam to curse Israel, he ultimately succeeded in persuading him to corrupt them, if you like, by more subtle means. This paints the picture for us where we need to be aware that sometimes Satan, when he doesn't succeed with a direct attack, he will often opt for an indirect one, simply by leading people into sin, thereby prompting God's judgment. Okay, so let's dive deep into the passage itself. The first 6 verses or so. Initially, we find Israel encamped in the acacia grove, and it is while camped there we see the people begin to engage in what is described as harlotry with the women of Moab. Now, these women invite the Israelites to sacrifice to their gods, and the people, well, they go along with it. They do that and they bow down before their gods, in fact, it tells us. And as a result of that, we see Israel becoming entangled with what are described as the Baal of Peor. Now, this, of course, provokes the anger of God. Moses is then told by God, he's instructed, in fact, to take all the leaders of the people, the ones who've been involved in this activity, kill the offenders before the Lord. By doing that, that will turn away God's fierce anger against Israel because of what has been going on. So following this command, Moses instructs the judges, the leaders, to execute those among their groups who had become entwined, joined up to these practices relating to Baal at Peor. So this initial section of the chapter serves to highlight for us the idolatry and the depth of the idolatry that Israel was engaged in, and it sets the stage for the unfolding events that follow, but also, I would suggest, should prompt us today to reflect on the consequences of a nation turning away from God. These first verses also provide us with the context by indicating the location of the Israelites. They're situated in that place where they were based, the acacia grove, which was and is their final stop before they would eventually enter Israel. The thing to note is that all of this began with sexual relationships between the Israelite men with the women of Moab, suggesting that there is prostitution involved in this by use of the term harlotry. Now, in the preceding chapters, it was Balak, the king of Moab, who sought to have them cursed by Balaam. However, we now learn that the entanglement of Israel is actually being caused and achieved by the women of Moab, who are seen to entice the men of Israel into committing what is described as harlotry with them, and it is that act that brings the curse upon them. Now, this act of harlotry, as it is described, is because, as this and other passages later explain, it is sexual activity, prostitution, was intertwined with the worship of Baal. At that time in the ancient world, prostitution was part of Baal worship. So this is not just ordinary sexual immorality. Well, of course, that would be bad enough. It's a form of occult idol worship which involved sex with people during those religious rituals. It's going to be further elaborated for us in subsequent verses and passages. But in the opening verses, we see simply that the women of Moab invite the Israelites to come mix with them and sacrifice to their gods. And the Hebrew text experts say that it particularly emphasizes the role of the woman involved in leading the Israelites astray. And the Israelites are depicted, aren't they, as literally bowing down to the gods of the Moabites. And by the way, this is corroborated for us in the Psalms, in Psalms like 106. These events are described there as well. Additionally, it's important to note is that it says they partook in sacrifices offered to the dead. So that's another layer of occult depravity added to their actions in all this. Awful, isn't it? But these practices are not unique to the Moabites. They were prevalent among many nations that surrounded Israel at that time. Idolatry, ritualized worship practices, were often coupled with prostitution. It was a very common phenomenon in the ancient world. And here we see Israel becoming joined to Baal, not surprisingly provoking the absolute anger burning of the Lord against such practices. So in response to this grievous sin, the Lord instructs Moses that they have to take the leaders of the people who were involved in this type of Baal worship and literally kill them in broad daylight. Now, this is a drastic measure, but it is, of course, meant to serve as a stark warning, saying the seriousness of this situation. And the judges of Israelites, they carry out the command, and they are seen to repent and weep before the temple proper after that. This is all underscoring the severity of the situation they're trying to deal with. This narrative, this story, is really significant in the history of Israel. In fact, it's referenced in several other biblical passages, including Deuteronomy 4, the Psalms, including very much so in Psalm 106, Hosea 9, and it's even referenced in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Having said all that, it kind of surprises me how little this passage is known compared to other Old Testament stories that aren't referenced nearly as much. However, what we need to note then is that these events hold profound significance in the collective memory of Israel. Now, I started out by noting that sometimes when you think things can't get worse, they do so. So what could be worse than committing adultery and idolatry? Well, we need to brace ourselves, friends, because it does indeed get worse. The first part of the passage discusses idolatry, whilst the second part of the passage focuses on the indecency of one particular man among the Israelites. Numbers 27, 6 to 18. The second half, beginning in verse 6, deals with this. Here we see introduced to us a scene where the Israelites, as I said, are mourning over these events at the entrance to the tabernacle. And amid this somber, repentant atmosphere, one Israelite, later identified as Zimri, boldly brings a Midianite woman named Cosbi into the camp. He literally parades her past Moses and the grieving congregation and takes her into the tent. This act of open defiance, open immorality, escalates the situation further. However, there's a response to this flagrant violation. Phinehas, a grandson of Aaron, takes decisive action. He actually enters the tent after them with a javelin in his hand and kills both the man and the woman, thereby immediately putting an end to their sin. Now, this act is not meant to be considered as murder. It's rather a form, perhaps the first time we see it, enacted in a personal way for personal sin, a form of capital punishment. Their actions were deemed to warrant such immediate and severe consequences. As a result of this incident and the fact that such uncleanliness entered the area of the Holy of Holies, the Lord, in response, sends a plague among the people, and immediately we find out that 24,000 perish. Now, I have to note there appears to be a discrepancy between the number given here and that mentioned in that passage in 1 Corinthians 10 I talked about earlier, where it states that 23,000 died. So how do we address the discrepancy? Well, there isn't really one there. If we examine 1 Corinthians 10 closely, we'll notice that Paul mentions that 23,000 were killed on that one day. Numbers actually doesn't specify the time period, and it says 24,000 people die in the plague overall. So it seems reasonable to me to assume that on that day of this action, 23,000 people died. Then Phineas acted and the plague was ended, but some remaining sick people perhaps died afterwards, maybe simply died after midnight on the same day. Thus, I don't believe that this supposed discrepancy is in any way a contradiction. Rather, it's just a complementary account of the same events from a slightly different perspective with a slightly different time frame. Anyway, I digress. What the important thing here is, in this dire situation where sin, profound sin, enters among the heart of the people, one man is seen to stand up for the righteousness of God. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, grandson of Aaron, displays fervent devotion to the Lord and his cause, and his desire for the people to remain cleansed from sin. Because of his fervor, the Lord is seen to spare the Israelites from any further devastation of the plague that had come upon them. And consequently, we see in these verses that the Lord, in fact, rewards Phinehas with a covenant of peace, as it's described, offering him and his family a perpetual priesthood through his descendants. This remarkable act of zeal, of standing up for God amid the moral decay and the willful attack on God's people, highlights for us Phinehas's, well, almost exemplary character in responding to this. Now, in the text, it actually confirms the identity of the offenders in some detail. It mentions that Zimri is from the tribe of Simeon, and Cosbi was a Midianite woman, but both had positions and came from families of some importance and authority. And I think this detail is added simply to underscore the significance of the depth of how much these tribes, the children of Israel and the Midianites, had been, well, the significance of how much they'd become entwined with each other, how much they'd implicated themselves amongst the Israelite society. And this, I suppose, is meant to be a reminder and underlying of the importance of community accountability and cohesiveness, especially when it comes to times of moral crisis. Now, as we continue into the book of Numbers, very soon we're going to encounter another census, emphasizing the ongoing significance of numbering and organizing and setting apart the people of Israel. These numerical records will not only reflect the organization of the nation, but will also convey spiritual truths about the moral position of that ongoing community historically. Significantly, when we examine the numbers for the tribe of Simeon, which will be revealed in a couple of chapters, we'll find out that at the first census they numbered 59,300, but then later on in chapter 26, verse 14, it specifically points out for us that their count has decreased to 22,200. The notable reduction could be attributed to their prominent involvement in the sinful incident that's described in this chapter, and the fact that the plague fell mainly upon that tribe. And then in the final part of this story, we encounter the Lord's response to these sinful actions, how he sets in place what he needs to do in the longer term. In verse 16, the Lord instructs Moses to take action against the Midianites, those who were complicit in seducing the Israelites. because they were so complicit in seducing the Israelites into idolatry and adultery. And God then says to Moses that he must treat the Midianites as enemies from here on in, implying an ongoing hostility, almost a state of war against them, again underlining and indicating the severity of this situation. Now, it's essential to note that the progression of events involving the Moabites, the Midianites, and the Israelites ultimately is one that leads to the judgment of the Lord falling. So the Lord then, even when atonement has been made, the Lord concludes by highlighting ongoingly the consequences of Israel's disobedience and the Lord's determination to hold them accountable into the future, and the Midianites as coming under a state of war, set in conflict thereafter against the children of Israel. Now, reflecting on this passage, I think we can draw obviously parallels to the broader ongoing history of Israel. Just as they'd experienced significant blessings in the past, followed by huge failures, this episode illustrates that similar familiar pattern of continuing to do this sort of thing again and again. If we go back to the beginning, the juxtaposition of receiving the Mosaic law almost followed immediately by them committing adultery and worshipping the golden calf underscores the fickleness not just of this nation of Israel, but also, I would suggest, fallen human nature in general. It shows the propensity for disobedience and how it will often follow on even after periods of divine favor. And then we see the depth of it played out in the actions of individuals like Zimri and this woman Cosby, meant to serve as stark reminders to the depths to which human depravity can descend. He reached the point where he and this woman had such brazen defiance and contempt for God's covenant, God's salvation plan for humanity, that he brought her up to before the Holy of Holies. That shows the danger of just how far pride, rebellion can lead people to fall. In contemporary times, the warning from the book of 1 John for us as Christian believers to keep ourselves from idols remains absolutely relevant still today. As materialism and other forms of idolatry continue to pervade every aspect of society, these passages are meant to warn us against this sort of spiritual waywardness. They're meant to resonate deeply, not just down through the history of Israel, but also for us today. Now, indeed, as we stand today and as we witness the very clear, obvious moral decline of our nations and individual people around us, we're compelled, after reading this passage, to ponder the sobering question, yet things have got bad, but how much worse than they can get? Now, I preached on this passage way back in 2006, and I looked at my notes in preparation for this today, and I noticed some of the things I could see happening in the UK and some of the things that I believe might happen in the near future. It's interesting to me what I said there. I referenced the fact that same-sex marriage was very soon going to become legal in the UK. And I pointed out that I believe that someday people will use the argument that was used to support same-sex marriage, they would apply it to polygamous unions. I also suggested that prostitution, for the most part illegal in the UK and around the world, I believed would be widely legalized, and in fact it would become the normalization of prostitution and could in fact become a reality in the future, where it's seen as almost a viable career option. There's the rising trend in our universities of particularly young women, mainly because that's where the opportunity exists. I'm sure men would do the same if they could, but young people, to a greater percent, as somewhere between 5 and 10%, are using a form of prostitution to fund their education by taking advantage of websites like OnlyFans. The widespread acceptance and normalization of prostitution I speculated in 2006 might become a reality in the future. Also, the undermining of the sanctity of life at both ends of the scale, in the rapid proliferation of abortion and the lessening of the rules and the guidelines around it, coupled with the exploitation of the disabled and the mentally ill and the elderly by assisted suicide becoming more widely accepted. Those were just the things that I could foresee in 2006. Sadly, it seemed I was correct in my predictions. Anyway, so that's where we are today. That's where we're going today. But drawing parallels to this ancient biblical narrative, we find a similar pattern of moral decay emerging here. A laissez-faire attitude to individual righteousness and not recognizing in any way its effect on the wider community. Here it emerged in the same way as it always does, immorality leading to idolatry. And in this story of Israel's sin and judgment, thankfully there emerges an individual, a single man in this passage, who exemplifies this zeal for the Lord amidst this moral degradation, degeneration that is happening all around him. So even today in our contemporary societies, even within our Christian communities, we're clearly more likely to see instances of moral compromise and wrongdoing than we ever have before. Yet amid this darkness, there remains the hope exemplified in Psalm 1199 that reminds us that if we cleanse our ways by aligning ourselves with God's word, then we can be brought back into a state of grace. Just as one individual's passion for the Lord here stood out in this narrative, I believe today individual believers who stand firm in their faith amidst societal decay around them can have a profound influence on holding back the tide, so to speak. So in conclusion, when looking at this passage from the perspective of how and where we live today, the trajectory of societal morality may seem bleak indeed. Yet there is still hope, this passage tells me. There is still hope that in our individual commitment to righteousness and love of the God, we too can not only be protected for it, but can help stem the rising tide. Friend, this passage tells me that we are called to navigate through a world that is increasingly at odds with the biblical principles. Yet still, as the psalmist wrote, we may too be like David. As Moses wrote, we may too be like Phineas and remain people who are after God's own heart. Hope our examination of this passage enables you to do that and live this way. Thanks for joining me today. That's it, friends. Fantastic to be with you today. Thank you for joining me. Please subscribe if you're not doing so already, and join me on this journey through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. You're able to listen to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, but by subscribing, you won't miss another episode. You should get a notification every time one's dropped in the future. The normal pattern is new podcasts every day, Monday to Friday, with occasional bonus episodes at the weekend. We're working through the entire Bible, alternate books, Old and New Testament, so when we finish off the book of Numbers, we'll be going into the Gospel of John, probably in about a week or two's time. So stick with me, friends, and let's try and complete this project together. Can I remind you that this podcast is hosted on the bibleproject.buzzsprout.com, and there you'll find ways in which you can connect to me. You can send me a text through that host website, And you'll find links to all the places where I put the additional free resources. Places like the social networks, YouTube, my LinkedIn page, all those places. And you'll find things like episode notes, as well as a full transcript of everything I've said today and every day. You'll also find a link there to the Patreon community, where you can decide to connect with this ministry on a more meaningful level. You can reach out and speak to me there. You can even support it if you want financially, although you don't have to do that to be part of the Patreon community. And that's the place where I put loads and loads of hours, in fact, over 50 hours at the minute, of bonus material. Stuff relating to the teaching and the evangelist type work I'm doing in secular environments in the midweek. You'll find places there which clearly doesn't fit within the Bible Project podcast series, but stuff I do where I go into wholly secular environments and try to address an issue that's of interest to the people there, but try and bring a Christian or a biblical perspective to it. Or I just share my response afterwards, or my preparation notes before I go into those environments. It's a real chance to peek behind the curtain and see what I'm doing in my everyday life. And I do hope you find it helpful, because I am addressing issues of psychology, what the world thinks philosophically, even in relation to the arts and artificial intelligence. There's all that sort of stuff going on over there. So why not take a look? It's all available on the Patreon community. And with that said, we'll leave it there for today. Thanks for being with me. I do hope you'll be back here again tomorrow. Oh, by the way, I also have a History of the Church podcast, which you can join over there. I call it the History of the Church because I'm placed it on the History Network as a way of podcast networks, as a way of attracting people who aren't believers to listen to perhaps to the history of the church. But between you and me, friends, it's really a history of the Holy Spirit working through the hearts and minds of all the major figures in church history. With that said, I'll say bye-bye for now, and I do trust I'll see you back here again tomorrow on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye now.